the fact that we can have a relationship with you because of what you have done for us. Thank you for the sacrifice of your Son. Thank you for your word that's a light to our path. Thank you for opportunities like tonight, because you put us into a family so that even through our brothers and sisters, you care for us and you help us. I pray that we'll derive the benefit of sharing in your word tonight to come to a better understanding of your will. We just want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the food. And thank you for the opportunity coming up with the movie night that we have to potentially have a great impact on our community. And I'm asking that you would bless us in that direction so that we might be able to bring more people into close relationship with you. God, thank you for the privilege of you working through us. And please bless our time together tonight. In Jesus' name I ask it. All right, Gospel of Mark, the 8th chapter. If you got your Bibles ready, I'm going to try to cover a little bit more ground tonight, but I need to say this. Mark chapter 8. I don't know if you remember clear back when we started this, and last week with the Thanksgiving meal, we did not have a session. The week before that, we had Gabe Ramirez with us, gave us an encouraging report about some of the groundwork that he's laying with the international students. So it's been a couple of weeks since we've been in the Gospel of Mark together here, but if you remember way back when we started this, we had kind of a rough outline on the Gospel of Mark. And one of the points that I'm persuaded is probably accurate is the Gospel of Mark kind of builds up to chapter 8. Kind of builds up to chapter 8. And one of the ways that we tried to emphasize that the last time that we met is we reviewed the first 7 chapters. And I had different people with signs. Remember this? We talked about here's a sign of Jesus over nature, Jesus over demonic forces, Jesus over illness, Jesus even over death, right? And in the Gospel of Mark, we see detailed accounts like chapter 5. Mark gives us the greatest detail of all the Gospel writers, which is shocking because he's the prefect, right? But he gives us the greatest detail on the legion, the Gadarene demoniac, we usually refer to him as the guy in the area of the Gadarenes. So Mark goes into great detail to make some basic points that we have God, right? Can you think of a couple places in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus makes the claim that he is equal with God? Do any of the stories in the Gospel of Mark come to your mind that we've seen so far? I'm putting you on the spot here. Okay, I saw lips move and hands go like this, but what part? What story?
He forgives sins.
Okay, when did he forgive sins? Okay. Capernaum, lowering down through the mat, he looks at him and says, your sins are forgiven. Okay, how is that a claim to be equal with God? Okay, they were thinking that only God can forgive sins, right? And Jesus kind of endorses that idea because he knew what they were thinking, which, by the way, that's kind of a sign that he's God, right? Because he knows what they're thinking, right? So he knows what they're thinking, and he says, in order that you might know what? That I do have authority to forgive sins. Okay, so we heal them to prove that I can forgive sins, which in turn proves that I am equal with God. Right, okay. Not to spend too much time on this, but let's even go back even further. What introduction does Mark give us at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry? Mark approaches Jesus' ministry, his life, a little bit differently. We don't get the Christmas account, do we? No, but we do get the forerunner. Who's the forerunner? That'd be John the Baptist. And he quotes a passage out of Isaiah, classic passage out of Isaiah that talks about John. But that passage that he quoted, do you remember which one it was? The voice of one crying in the wilderness, the one who does what? Prepares the way for say it again? Yahweh. He takes that passage, which it's true, it uses God's name, which there are a lot of different names from God, but this is the one that at the burning bush, right? Exodus chapter 3, when Moses asked that question. If people say, what's your name? What am I supposed to say? I met this powerful being at a burning bush. I don't know his name. What's his name? And God says, my name is what? Yahweh, which usually translated into English comes out like what? I am that I am, right? I am. It's so interesting. Anyway, that name, that's the prophecy. He's going to prepare the way for God the Father. And Mark says that's what John did when he prepared the way for Jesus. So there are many different clues throughout the Gospel of Mark. Now, the reason I wanted to rehearse this is Mark is building up. He kind of gives us, okay, here's Jesus dealing with demonic forces. Here's Jesus dealing with disease. Here's Jesus dealing with hunger and other physical needs. What was the guy's name who had a daughter that he rose from the dead? Jairus' daughter, a 12-year-old girl, he brings her back from the dead. So Jesus, over all these things, Jesus makes the claim of being God. Now, we're finally ready for the disciples to get it. This is the chapter where Peter makes his confession, right? You are the Christ. The reason I want to say this is I want you to see how he builds up to this. Because if we're building up to this point where, okay, he is the Messiah. That's what Christ means, right? He's the Messiah. All these things, the last two that we're going to see right here that builds up to the crescendo are kind of like, really? Really? You're going to build up to one of the most powerful statements with these? Okay, I want you to ask the question, why these at the end? Because typically we think of start with the small stuff and they build up, right? That's not what Mark does. What does he do in the 8th chapter? Here you go. Mark chapter 8. Beginning of verse 1, it says, in those days, again, a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat. He called his disciples to him, and he said to them, I have compassion on the crowds, because they have been with me now for 3 days, and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they'll faint on the way. So we get the sign that Jesus is concerned about people's even their basic needs, right? So he's concerned that they'll faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. Verse 4, the disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in a desolate place? Okay, this is the feeding of the 4,000. We've already had the feeding of the 5,000. He's going to mention in just a minute, I fed 5,000 as well as 4,000. So we know this is the second feeding. What happened at the first feeding? How much food did they come up with before the fact? What was the little boy's lunch? 5 loaves, 2 fish, and he multiplies it to feed 5,000 men plus women and children. How much did they gather up afterwards? 12 baskets, right? He's going to use a different term here in the feeding of the 4,000. Okay, the reason I'm belaboring this just a little bit, if you were there and saw Jesus use one piece of pizza to feed 5,000, one small meal to feed 5,000 people. If you saw what I saw, that's what you'd be saying. Anyway, if you use one meal to feed 5,000, then when Jesus said, hey, we got a bunch of people who need to eat, what would you be saying?
Can you do it again?
Okay, there's a classic commentary on the Gospel of Mark. It's written by a guy named William Lane, not to be confused with William Lane Craig, 2 different guys. But in this commentary, the reason I appreciate this commentary, this guy's a Greek expert, really knows the Greek language really well. And he says it's very hard to translate, but there is a difference between these two. Because I'll be honest with you, I'm reading these 2 stories, I'm thinking, guys, where were you when Jesus fed 5,000? You know, what's up with this response? The response in verse 4, his disciples answered him, how could we feed these people with the bread here in this desolate place? Lane says in the English, it's more like the first time feeding of the 5,000, they're like throwing their hands up saying, there's no way in the world we can feed. This phrase, though, it's hard to translate in English, but it's more like, I don't think we can feed them, can we? You know, it's a little bit more tentative. Can I say it that way? It's hard to convey this idea. They didn't have the faith they should have, right? But there does seem to be some progress. Okay, which leads me to ask this question. Why did Jesus feed 4,000 people? I have a very quiet audience tonight, but I can tell that they're thinking, why did he feed 4,000 people? Okay, they were hungry. But not everybody who was hungry was fed by Jesus, were they? What was the purpose? What was the purpose of feeding the 5,000? Because they were hungry is a minor purpose. What's the major purpose that Jesus was displaying in feeding the 5,000?
He's the bread of life.
Okay. The purpose of a miracle is to verify the message and the messenger. It verified that he was God in the flesh and that he had come from God. This is one of the ways he was doing that. Why repeat a miracle? Because this is very close. We could call it kind of a repeat. Why do you repeat things to your children?
Because people forget.
Or maybe they didn't really get it the first time. Maybe we need to go over this again. I think there's probably a lot of that with the disciples right here. They hopefully, later on they are going to get it, but maybe they should have been a little bit further. In fact, I think we're on safe ground to say that, because when Jesus comes back and he talks about this, he's going to say, guys, I'm sorry, I always ad-lib this. I need to come up with a better way of saying this. But in so many words, he looked to his disciples and said, are you that stupid? In so many words, And check me out, because I think we're going to get there. Anyway, his disciples showed disbelief again, but it's not as bad as the first time. So they're a little tentative here. And in verse 5, and he asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, which again is setting another example here. He gives thanks before he breaks the loaves, and he gives it to his disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd, and they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. Verse 8, and they ate and were satisfied. 4,000 people had enough to eat and be satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces that were left over, 7. Okay, the word here should not be translated baskets, because this is the same word that's used when the Apostle Paul was lowered over the wall to get him out of the city. So the first time, the feeding of the 5,000, they would be much smaller baskets, the kind of backpack size. In fact, a lot of times that's what they would do. They would wear them on their back and carry around basic meals. These are think of a hamper, right? Enough that a person could fit inside of. So they had 7 of these larger baskets, and there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. Verse 10, and immediately he got in a boat with his disciples, and went to the district of Bourne. And the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Okay, I want to say it one more time. We're building up to a crescendo here. We've got a repeat miracle, not a repeat, but a very close, right? Feeding 5,000, feeding of 4,000. Next, we've got interaction with the Pharisees again. Have we had interactions with the Pharisees before? Yes, we've had interactions with the Pharisees. What do the Pharisees say this time? Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven. Push pause for just a second. Mark has just given us an overview of a couple of years of Jesus' ministry here. And what has Jesus done? He's raised the dead. He's calmed the storm. He's fed 5,000. He's fed 4,000. He's driven out demons. In fact, a legion of demons. Just about every test you could throw his way. He's proven himself over and over again. And the Pharisees come up and say, yeah, but we want to suffer. Okay, a lot of people look at this and say they must have been wanting a special kind of sign. No doubt, no doubt. They were looking for something that would really meet their qualifications. But having said that, I think there's a lot of reason to believe that. I don't think they were really looking for something to meet their qualifications. The more I learn about the Pharisees, typically come and ask a question to test Jesus, not just ask him a question. Try to put him on the spot. They don't want to believe. I mean, how in the world can you look at, why are all the crowds coming to Jesus? Because of all the miracles that he's performed. There is so much evidence. It's just not what they wanted. Please keep that in mind. It's just not what they were looking for, not what they wanted. Okay, I'm gonna jump way ahead, but when Jesus was on the cross, one of the things that the religious leaders said to mock Jesus was, if he's the Son of God, let God deliver him. Remember that when they mocked Jesus on the cross? Do you remember also what they said? They said, then we'll believe him. There's no way in the world. I'm convinced they wouldn't have believed him. They already made up their decision. They didn't want to believe him. Okay, but they want things on their own terms. They want things on their own terms. Let me leave it at that so we can get a broader picture here. Verse 12, and he sighed deeply in his spirit, and he said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Okay. Of course, Jesus said this, of course, it's true. But let me ask you a question first. Has any sign been given to that generation?
Yes.
Okay, what does he mean? If Mark has detailed all these evidences, all these signs that have already been given, then why did Jesus say you're not going to get any sign?
I'm going to get the one you want.
Thank you. Obviously, what he's saying, he's given them a bunch of signs, and so when he says, I'm not going to give you a sign, it doesn't mean no signs at all. It means it's not the one you want. Let me say it this way. I just want to cut to the chase. Jesus is very clearly saying, I'm not going to do my ministry on your terms. You don't get to decide what I do. Okay, I think Mark is really going to bring this point home with the next two things that leads up to the confession. I think we're going to make this. He left them and got into the boat again. And he went to the other side, and they'd forgotten to bring bread with them, and they only had one loaf with them on the boat. And so this brings out another teaching opportunity, right? They're talking about how they don't have much bread. So here's what Jesus says. In verse 15, he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven. What's leaven? Yeah, it's like yeast, causes the bread to raise. You only need a little bit of it. Otherwise, you've got unleavened bread. You ever had unleavened bread? Every time you have communion, you had unleavened bread. That's unleavened bread. It's more like crackers today or whatever. It doesn't puff out, right? Because it doesn't have yeast in it. Okay? So when he talks about leaven, you don't need much, but it permeates the entire loaf of bread, right? And it makes it rise. He says, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. I find that so interesting that he mentions Herod as well. We'll come back to that. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. Okay. He said that because we only have one loaf of bread. Jesus said, aware of this, aware of the fact that they're talking about they don't have bread, he said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? This is where I'm thinking he's saying, are you really that not smart? Can I say it that way? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets of pieces did you take up? And they said 12. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? This is why we know it's not just a retelling of the same story. Jesus brings up 2 examples. And he brings up the point of probably why he gave them 2 examples, because they still don't get it. Right? It's proof that he's God. He's the one you listen to. Don't be deceived by the teachings of the Pharisees, because a little bit of bad teaching goes a long way. How much cow manure does it take in the glass of water for you not to want to drink the water?
Not much.
Not a whole lot. It doesn't take a lot of bad to ruin good, right? And he says, you gotta watch out for this. So listen to Jesus and don't listen to the popular teaching of the day, even though it's the popular teaching of the day, right? Okay, I know I'm just skimming the surface, but I want us to get this overall picture. He says in verse 22, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man, and he begged him to touch him. I love this story. Just going to tell you right up front, I love this story, because he's building up to the crescendo, and here's the one right before we find out he's the Christ, right? Here's the story. He took the blind man by the hand, he led him out of the village, and when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and he said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking around." And Jesus laid his hands on him, on his eyes again. And he opened his eyes and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him home saying, "Do not even enter into the village." Now we're ready for the confession, right? But before we do that, we've had the raising of the dead, the casting out of demons. We've had the calming of the storm. It was so dramatic that the disciples say, "Who is this man?" So we've had all these wonderful things. And then the last miracle, Jesus heals this guy and he can't quite see. And so it's like, okay, let me try again. I'm being very facetious here. I don't mean any disrespect. But how in the world does that build up to God in the flesh? Since you guys aren't talking, I'm just going to tell you my thoughts on this. I think it's a powerful lesson because it's so shocking. Because that's not the way you're supposed to do it. And I think that's exactly why Jesus did it that way. Because we look at that as, well, that wasn't one of his better miracles. You know what? It was exactly the way he wanted to do it. And I think one of the messages that he's sending to us is, I don't do miracles the way you say I have to do miracles. I don't teach the way you say I have to teach. I don't give signs the kind of signs you're asking for. Do you see how Mark's building up to this? He's not just building up saying, nobody's ever seen this kind of power. Nobody's ever seen this. But they also can't put him in a box. We don't know what Jesus is going to say, so we have to listen to what Jesus says. Right? It's the idea. If he's really God, then I don't have him all figured out. That's why I have to listen. Do you understand how something that seems so out of place is actually a very powerful signifier that he is beyond us, because he doesn't fit into the scheme that we would usually think the way it should be. And so it says, and Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Here we come to the confession, right? They told him, first of all, the people, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others one of the prophets. Don't have much time for this, but who would be saying that Jesus is, by the way, did Mark already tell us John the Baptist is dead?
Yes.
Yeah, he's dead. So if he is John the Baptist, that means he has to be John the Baptist come back to life. Who do we know that thought Jesus was John the Baptist come back to life? Herod. Why would Herod think that Jesus is John the Baptist come back to life? Because he has a guilty conscience, right? He's the one who put Herod to death, put John the Baptist to death, and he knew he shouldn't have done it, right? So Herod buys into this idea, perhaps some other people. Okay, let me ask you this question, though. What do we know about John the Baptist? What kind of preacher was John the Baptist? When religious leaders came out to meet John the Baptist, did he say, "I'm so glad you're here. Would you sign our guest book? We need to do a follow-up because we want to make sure you come back to the Jordan next week." What did he say to, I'm sorry, I just have this extra measure of facetiousness in my veins now. "Yeah, you brood of vipers, who warned you to come out here," right? The axe is already laid at the root of the tree. Yeah, my estimation of John the Baptist is very powerful preacher, but he'd blow you out of the saddle, right? As far as right between the eyes, very powerful. What else does he say? Some people say Elijah. What was the prophecy about Elijah tied to the Messiah? The last chapter of the Old Testament, Malachi, the 4th chapter. Before the Messiah comes, Elijah is going to come first. How was that fulfilled? And don't say the Mount of Transfiguration.
No, John the Baptist.
Yeah, because what is it, Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says the fulfillment of that is John the Baptist, right? He is the fulfillment of the prophecy about Elijah. So they knew Elijah had to come first. So maybe John the Baptist, some speculate Elijah. Others said one of the prophets. In fact, over in Matthew chapter 16, they also mention Jeremiah, right, or one of the prophets. I find that fascinating, and I'll just make this one brief comment. When Jesus is represented in the movies, doesn't look like John the Baptist, doesn't look like Elijah or Jeremiah. He just looks like a real passive guy most of the time. You ever notice that in most of the movies? Listen, they're comparing him to people we're thinking, wow, he could be compassionate, but he could say, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, you hypocrites. He could be very, very confrontational as well. And he asked them, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, you are the Christ. What does the term Christ mean? Anointed one. If you go out of the Greek language as Christ, if you go out of the Hebrew language, translation would be Messiah. But both Messiah and Christ mean the anointed one. Who did they anoint in Old Testament times? Yeah, priests, high priest in particular, because in the book of Psalms it talks about oil over Aaron's head, runs down his beard. The high priest, who else? King, before he took the throne, he was anointed on the day that he took the throne. And what's the third one?
Prophet.
Yeah, remember when Elijah was told to go and anoint the king, and his successor, who would be Elisha, he was supposed to anoint him as well. So 2 kings and 1 prophet. Okay, so prophet, priest, and king all brought together the special anointed one from God. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Common theme throughout the Gospel of Mark. Why? They weren't ready yet. Jesus, remember the analogy Jesus used about the mustard seed turning into a grape tree, or a lamp that's underneath a bushel, and then there's going to come a time when it's disclosed, and it's going to bring light to everybody in the house. The idea is, the way Mark presents it, there's a time when Jesus isn't going totally public yet. His time had not yet come. But there will come a day when everybody will know. Everybody will know. Better part of wisdom there. So, here's the time, and here's our questions. We already answered this first question, but if you want to talk about that a little bit more in your group, that'd be great. After all these powerful miracles, why mention one that doesn't seem to go so well? This is the guy who takes 2-stage sight healing, right? Just want to make sure at that point gets across. And then, for most of your discussion tonight, I'd really like you to try to tackle this one. If Jesus reprimanded his disciples for their lack of understanding, are you so dull, are you so slow, do you still not get it? What do you think he'd say to us who have the entire Bible? What do you think? I mean, seriously, what do you think Jesus would say when you ask that question? Do you think he'd turn to you and say, that's such a great question? Maybe. I don't want to answer this question for you. I'd like you to talk about this and kind of review questions. So, Dennis, Greg's group, next door, adult room. If you haven't been a part of a group yet, you want to join the guys group is in the foyer. Or you can join the existing group. Either group, you're welcome to join. If you're here just for the Bible study, thank you for participating. I'm going to go ahead and dismiss the group right now. And grab more pizza on your way out, please.